Hello, my name is Dr. Artika Tyner. I'm the founder of Planting People Growing Justice Press and Bookstore. I'm honored to be here with you today to share about my story, about my Rondo story, and how it helped to connect me to my culture, my heritage, and my overall legacy. So I'll begin with the words of Marcus Garvey to remind us why stories matter, because he reminds us that a people without knowledge of their past history, origins, and culture are like a tree without roots. So my Rondo story is what has rooted and grounded me in my own destiny and my own purpose being fulfilled in meaningful ways. So as I think about my Rondo story, it is deeply rooted in a sense of what is leadership, on how we can help to not only define leadership, but redefine it in a way of how do we think about building our communities, strengthening our communities, but also making sure that we have strong families as well. And that's rooted in a sense of who we are as leaders, who we are in the type of legacy that we create, who we are in the type of connections that we create, and the type of values that we live out. And the very essence of leadership, of course, is about vision. So I'm going to bring in Dr. George Washington Carver for this piece. Where there is no vision, there is no hope. So an introduction and the foundation of any strong leadership platform is vision, to be able to set a course of where we're headed and how we'll get there. And my Rondo story is because of the vision of my family. 5 generations of my 4 mothers and 4 fathers lived on this sacred ground that we call Rondo. It's also about a commitment to equity, to justice, and freedom. So it's the very essence of social justice. So I have a quote here from Paul Robeson that reminds us that we have to make a choice. What type of impact do we want to have? And if I think about my family in relationship to social justice, it was what activated them to be involved in the civil rights movement, to make sure that equal justice under the law came alive. And last but not least, a part of our Rondo story is another dimension of leadership, about servant leadership. So the ability and the capacity to activate and live out our faith is a part of our Rondo story. So here it is from Rabbi Hillel. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? When I am for myself alone, what am I? And the last question really is the experience that I learned from a little girl growing up in Rondo. If not now, when? When will I choose to make an impact? When will I choose to lead change? And when will I choose to make a difference in the world? So when we think about leadership, oftentimes it's defined as a position or a title or an exercise of power. It's a pyramid image. Someone's on the top and everybody else is just following suit. But we know, based upon my cultural tradition, that it's important to think about leadership more as a circle, the circle of community, the circle of, oftentimes we hear it as the village. So Rondo was that village. As many people migrated north, including my own family, having their migration north gave them an opportunity. They were following what they believed in general sense was the North Star. Although they were thinking about it in the sense of freedom, liberty, economics, and the American dream, they also knew the importance and knew that they had to follow this guiding star to create a legacy and a pathway for generations to come. So oftentimes we just see it as a hashtag that we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. But the reality of it is, it's actually an action verb, that we are just that through our ancestors' prayers, through their fierce determination and their tenacity, they helped to create the narratives, the stories, and for me, as I talk about Rondo, the community that I benefit from still yet today. And when I think about this, it's also the inspiration and spark for my dissertation and my research on redefining leadership, that each of us can be those planters of ideas, a seed of change, and a vision for justice. What is really then compelling us to think about in those small ways, how can we make a difference? How can we plant the seed? For my family who migrated north, planting the seed was about creating those new opportunities to education, creating a pathway to home ownership. So when we think about our challenge today, where are you planting seeds? And what will the harvest be? How will you be intentional about this as you're leading change for yourself, your family, and your community, and also society? So for me, my Rondo story was something that I learned about in my adulthood. I knew that my family was from Rondo, but I didn't know how we got there. And in Minnesota, yes, we're evolving into a rich multicultural landscape, but the reality of it was growing up and all the way throughout most of my adulthood, I tended to be the only person of color in many rooms that I was in. Being the first, but I knew I wasn't the first to receive an award or an accolade. I was the first to be noticed. There's a key distinction. So when I think about that, I had to learn more about my history. So I had an opportunity to meet the award-winning author, Isabel Wilkerson, during one of her lectures. And I'll never forget it. She was asking that question of, where are you from? And of course I said Rondo, but I said with hesitancy. But most people do not believe that my family has lived in Rondo and lived in St. Paul for generations. And then she started asking some questions. What were their occupations? What were their backgrounds? And that's when we figured out that my family was a part of the Great Migration, that they actually were led all the way to Minnesota because of a family connection, that someone was a Pullman porter. So they were able to, by generations, move everyone here one by one, two by two, to have a fresh start, to chase the dreams that they had imagined for generations. But of course, the reality of it is, when we look at the history of America, the story was interrupted. Yes, they came with great dreams. Yes, they had great ambition. Yes, they were not afraid of hard work. But here it is, laws and policies impacted them right away, because the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 did what? It put freeways and interstates through the heart of communities like Rondo, which of course led to displacement, which of course led to active disruption to economic justice. We lost the hope overnight of being able to inherit intergenerational wealth, because for so many of us, we lost our family homes. And yes, some will say, well, it was a legal proceeding as it relates to eminent domain. That's in the Constitution, of course. But the challenge then becomes, eminent domain, was there really the fair market value paid to our families? What happened to us as a result of not just losing our homes, but also losing our businesses? At its peak, Rondo had over 400 businesses. Today, we have less than a dozen Black-owned businesses in the same district. In addition to that, we have to think about, what do the pillars of restorative justice look like? What's the hope for the future? As that quote from Dr. George Washington Carver, what do we need to think about? So I would say an invitation of telling a story, we have to first tell it right. We have to tell it with honesty. We have to tell it with truth. And my Minnesota story, my Rondo story is problematic. But it's not just my story in isolation, but I have to tell it and tell truth to power. That although Minnesota is known as one of the happiest places to live, known as one of the places that's best to raise your family, known as a place where you have more possibility to become that first-time millionaire, the reality of it is, it's a tale of two cities. It's separate and unequal still yet today in 2021. We have racial disparities for African Americans in every category of life, from having disproportionate poverty rates, disproportionate rates in incarceration as well, education, one of the lowest educational attainment rates and graduation rates in the nation. You have all these pieces coming together. And this is not in the abstract. It's not just because I'm a civil rights attorney that I'm sharing this data, or a researcher. It's because all the things that I just listed have impacted my own family right here in Rondo. So it gives us then the challenge to think about, what can we do to advance racial justice? That my story is not just the triumph of the Great Migration and the many successes of my foremothers and forefathers. And it's not then just interrupted in the sense of the highway going through the center of our communities, displacing us and us losing our intergenerational wealth. And it's not just even where we are today with the disparities that I just shared. The beauty of a story is that we get to add new chapters each day, second by second, moment by moment. So the beauty of my work is that I'm still writing my Rondo story. And I do this every day as I go out and share about our Rondo history, as I go out and share about the heroes and sheroes that inspired me to be who I am today. That's the power of storytelling. And it's also about connection. So I don't want you to think this just impacted Rondo alone. There are over 1,000 documented cases of racial removal across the nation. I just listed a few: the Gullah Geechee Nation in Florida, New Orleans. I was just in Tulsa for the centennial of the racial massacre. One of the things that's right in the heart of the middle of Tulsa in the Greenwood District is what? A highway or interstate that's now called Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Highway. So as we look at these challenges, it's not just Rondo. I want us to see this as a national crisis that in many ways, as developers and as a federal government was making a decision They wrote a storyline that impacted us for generations to come, in a belief that African American communities were the communities of least resistance, that they were irrelevant, that they wouldn't understand the law. But guess what? All those things planted a seed for the legacy of those civil rights attorneys and social engineers like myself today, that know our story, that know our history, and are determined to ensure that it's not repeated, while at the same time rectifying the wrongs of the past. So when we look at the past, there's just a few things that I want to highlight. I already discussed this piece of losing intergenerational wealth, some of the challenges of the past. But oftentimes people want you to say, oh, that was so long ago. This was so far in the distance. No, in fact, if we look at this in the Federal Aid Highway Act, this wasn't within my mother's generation that this occurred. So it wasn't a million years ago. This is in current contemporary times. So the past then, there's a monument in Washington, D.C. near the National Mall. This is the past is the prologue. So in many ways then in the present, when we ask those questions, for instance, in Minnesota, why is it that African Americans have one of the lowest home ownership rates in the nation right here? And I would connect it to the data of displacement in Rondo. So the past then being a prologue of many of the challenges that we face today. So here it is then, an invitation. How do we write those other chapters? How do we move forward knowing this is our opportunity to continue the story, but continue the story in promoting resiliency and promoting power and hope for the future? So one of the ways that I just want us to think about this through a social justice lens is making sure that we're acknowledging, first, that there's been harms in the stories of people of color and African Americans in particular. There's been harms, and the reason why I became an attorney, because they've been fueled by laws and policies. So there's been an injury. Then it creates an obligation for someone to make it right, whether it's a government or an individual. How do you make it right? And then the engagement to look ahead to the future to help build a brighter future. So here's one way that it's happening in Minnesota of that restorative justice, social justice lens. There's a new project called Reconnect Rondo that will create a cap over or a land bridge over I-94, the highway that went through the center of our community. And the mission is to both do the economic revitalization while also connecting the Minnesota community to our history and celebrating the rich cultural tapestry of our local communities. How do we foster it? How do we continue to build upon it and celebrate it as one of our greatest strengths? And one of the ways that we've been able to do this as well is through our writings and publications. There are book series now on Rondo. So our stories are not forgotten, starting at the intergenerational approach with our children, leading all the way up to adult pieces and books and memoirs as well. So I encourage you in thinking about not just sharing your story verbally, but I want you to also write your story so it can be documented, to make sure that you tell your story on your own terms with clarity, purpose, and power. So I conclude with the thought of, who are we? We started off with that piece from Marcus Garvey. So yes, I traveled back on many occasions throughout the continent of Africa to connect back to my African roots. So that way I could be that tree that flourishes, that tree that leaves a strong legacy for generations to come. So I had an opportunity. I entered into a poetry contest. So in St. Paul, and that's where Rondo is located, there's also a sidewalk project where poets, our words, are placed into the new sidewalks as they're being replaced throughout the city. So here it is. Here's my poem. I'll give you some context of why I wrote it and some of the core themes. But it reads, I am Rondo, and connected to a rich cultural history of unity, faith, and purpose. I am my African roots. I am freedom and justice. So of course, the first line you've heard about, me being a part of Rondo and the values that have helped to inspire me and compel me to action as a civil rights attorney. But in addition to that, being my African roots, it means that I know from which I've come. I know the legacy from which I've come from. By having the opportunity to travel to the slave castles, both in Cape Coast and Elmina, I get a sense of the real resiliency that's within me, that I couldn't be defined by and bound by any chains. there were none that could contain me. So I had to get a clear sense of who I was. So in being a part of my community in the Akwamu traditional land, I know one of the things that's very important about our identity is that we are the conquerors of all conquerors. So it gives us a strength and resilience to also rewrite a narrative, because in many ways, we only write a narrative that starts with slavery for the African-American experience. But you forgot then a chapter of the Akwamus, that the Akwamus, wherever they were taken, and there was an attempt to bind them with those chains of slavery, they could never be bound. They resisted and fought for freedom for themselves and others. And in addition to this, another story that we never talk about, that's history, is that the Akwamus also took over a slave castle, the Christenberg slave castle from the Danes. And our king, Odenigbo Okoto III, still has those keys today that symbolizes our active resistance, our active hope for the future. So in many ways, when we think about my African roots, that's a source of strength that's unwavering, unstoppable, and unmovable. So when I recognize that, it connects me back to Ghana. And when I think about the work of what has emerged in Ghana and the fact that many of our civil rights leaders in the 1960s traveled to Ghana, whether it was Malcolm X or Dr. Martin Luther King, or more importantly, that Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois resettled there. And why am I naming these pieces? Because they understood that the future of civil rights is coupled with human rights, and it's coupled with a connection to Mama Africa. So I'll close with a quote from Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the first Prime Minister of Ghana. He tells us that I'm not African because I was born in Africa, but I'm African because Africa was born in me. So for what's in me, what's in my story, I hope this is a compelling piece to share what's within you with others, to give them the source of inspiration that they need, in the words of Kwame Nkrumah, to go forwards ever and backwards never. Thank you.